The town of Millfield sits nestled in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, surrounded by dense forest that turns a deep, impenetrable black at night. In 1987, it was a thriving community of just under 5,000 people, anchored by its lumber mill and the regional high school that served several neighboring towns. Millfield High School's modest brick building, built in the 1950s, was unremarkable save for the gleaming trophy case that dominated its main hallway, a testament to the basketball dynasty that had become the pride of the town. The Millfield Wolves had won 3 state championships in the previous decade. Basketball wasn't just a sport in Millfield. It was the heartbeat of the community. On Friday nights, the gymnasium swelled with spectators, parents, grandparents, neighbors, and alumni, all drawn together by the shared ritual of hometown glory. The team's success had put this otherwise forgotten corner of America on the map, at least in regional sports columns. 1987 was supposed to be another triumph, with a senior-heavy team led by shooting guard Thomas Wyatt, whose jump shot was so fluid and natural that college scouts had begun to attend games by his junior year. The Wolves were favored to take the state title once more. Coach Harold Fleming, a former player himself who had returned to his hometown to build a legacy, had shaped what many considered his finest team yet. "This is a special group," Fleming told the Millfield Gazette in November 1986. "They play like they have been together their whole lives." Because they have. Indeed, most of the starting 5 had played ball together since elementary school. Thomas Wyatt, David Keller, James Pritchard, Andrew Fisher, and Michael Hayes were more than teammates. They were a brotherhood forged through countless hours on outdoor courts, in driveways, and eventually in the high school gymnasium, where their names would one day be enshrined. The 1986-87 season unfolded like a dream. The Wolves steamrolled their conference, dropping only one game, a 2-point loss to their bitter rivals from Black River High when Thomas Wyatt was sidelined with the flu. By February, they had secured their place in the state tournament and were preparing for a first-round matchup against Lakeside Academy, a private school from the eastern part of the state. The game was scheduled for Friday, February 3rd. No one in Millfield was particularly superstitious about the date. If anything, the team joked about it being bad luck for their opponents. The forecast called for snow, not unusual for February in that part of the country, but nothing that would make travel impossible. Coach Fleming arranged for the team to travel in the school's activity bus, a 1979 International Harvester painted in the school's blue and gray colors. Assistant coach Robert Tanner would drive, as he always did for away games. 17 people boarded that bus on the morning of February 13, 12 players, 2 coaches, the team manager, the school's athletic director Paul Winston, and Mrs. Elaine Novak, a math teacher who often served as a chaperone for away games. They were expected to return late that night, regardless of the game's outcome. The Millfield Wolves never came home. The first sign that something was wrong came at approximately 11:30 p.m., when several parents gathered at the school parking lot to welcome the team home, win or lose. Thomas Wyatt's mother, Diane, had baked his favorite chocolate chip cookies, while James Pritchard's father, Bill, brought thermoses of hot chocolate to ward off the winter chill. The snow had begun to fall lightly, dusting the parking lot with a pristine white layer. By midnight, the parking lot held a dozen cars, headlights periodically sweeping the entrance, as parents craned their necks, expecting to see the blue and gray bus turning in at any moment. Someone had heard on the radio that Millfield had won the game 68-56, advancing to the next round. There should have been celebrating. I tried calling the school where they played, but nobody answered. Bill Pritchard later told investigators. It was late, so that made sense. But Harold always called from a payphone when they were about an hour out. Always. By 1:00 a.m., the first call went to the Millfield Police Department. Officer Daniel Murray took the call and initially assured the parents that the team was likely delayed by the weather, which had worsened in the past hour. Nevertheless, he made calls to state police checkpoints along the most likely route from Lakeside Academy back to Millfield. No one had seen the Millfield bus. By 3:00 a.m., What began as concern had evolved into outright panic. Police Chief Walter Hayes, father of forward Michael Hayes, mobilized every available officer. The school superintendent was notified, and a command center was established in the high school gymnasium. Dawn broke on February 14 with no word from anyone on the bus. No one answered the calls to Coach Fleming's newly purchased Motorola cell phone, one of the few in town acquired specifically for team travel emergencies. "We are treating this as a missing persons case," Chief Hayes told the assembled parents, his voice steady despite the fear that must have gripped him as a father. "The state police have been notified, and they are checking every road between here and Lakeside." The weather complicated search efforts. 6 inches of snow had fallen overnight, covering any tracks the bus might have left if it had gone off the road. The main highways were being cleared, but the back roads, which the team might have taken as shortcuts or to avoid traffic, remained treacherous and impassable in some sections. By noon on February 14, the story had reached regional news outlets. By evening, it was national news. "High school basketball team vanishes after tournament game," read the headline in the Saturday evening edition of the Washington Post. Satellite trucks from network news stations descended on the small town, transforming the high school parking lot into a sea of antennas and cables. The first significant lead came from a gas station attendant in Preston, a small town approximately halfway between Lakeside Academy and Millfield. Scott Hammond was working the night shift at Preston Fill and Go on February. At approximately 9:15 p.m., he recalled serving a school bus full of basketball players who had stopped for fuel and snacks. They were in good spirits, Hammond told police, laughing, joking around. The coach bought coffee for himself and the other adults. One of the players' tall kid, dark hair, was showing off a medal or something on a ribbon, said they'd just won their game. Security camera footage from the gas station confirmed Hammond's account. The grainy video showed the Millfield bus pulling in, several players exiting to enter the convenience store, then reboarding approximately 15 minutes later. The timestamp read 9/7. This would be the last confirmed sighting of the Millfield Wolves. The route from Preston to Millfield offered several options. The most direct was Highway 16, which wound through the mountains in a series of switchbacks and steep grades. In good weather, this route would take approximately 90 minutes. Given the snowy conditions, it might have taken 2 hours or more. There was also County Road 27, a less maintained but more direct back road that locals sometimes used as a shortcut, shaving 15 minutes off the journey despite its narrower lanes and limited guardrails. Search efforts focused on these two routes. Helicopters scanned the terrain once the weather cleared on February 15, while ground teams checked every turnout, ravine, and embankment. The search extended to logging roads, fire trails, and even hiking paths where the bus couldn't possibly have traveled, based solely on the desperate hope that the team might have abandoned the vehicle and continued on foot for some reason. Nothing was found. No skid marks breaking through the fresh snow. No broken guardrails. No debris that might indicate an accident. The bus and its 17 passengers had simply vanished somewhere between Preston and Millfield. As days stretched into weeks, the investigation expanded. Every registered sex offender within a 100-mile radius was interviewed. Known criminal organizations were scrutinized for any connection to the area or to anyone on the bus. The personal lives of the coaches, players, and other passengers were examined for conflicts, threats, or unusual behavior leading up to February. One theory focused on assistant coach Robert Tanner, who had been with the program for only 2 years. A background check revealed a DUI arrest in 1983, though he had completed probation and maintained a clean record since. Some speculated that Tanner might have been drinking before driving, leading to an accident he then attempted to cover up. However, everyone who saw him at the game and at the gas station in Preston reported that he seemed completely sober. Another avenue of investigation centered on Paul Winston, the athletic director. Winston had allegedly been involved in a heated dispute with the school board over budget allocations. There were unsubstantiated rumors that he had misappropriated funds from the athletic department, though no formal accusations had ever been made. Could Winston have orchestrated the team's disappearance as some kind of elaborate distraction or insurance scam? Investigators found the theory far-fetched but explored it nonetheless, finding no evidence to support it. The most persistent theory involved a local figure known as William Bill Corrigan. Corrigan owned vast tracts of land in the mountains surrounding Millfield, inherited from his grandfather who had made a fortune in coal mining. Reclusive and eccentric, Corrigan was known to patrol his property heavily armed, confronting hikers and hunters who strayed across his boundaries. He had been arrested twice for making threats against local officials who attempted to enforce building codes on his various mountain properties. 3 months before the team's disappearance, Coach Fleming had a public confrontation with Corrigan at a town council meeting. Fleming was advocating for a new access road to the high school that would cut through the edge of Corrigan's land. Witnesses reported that Corrigan pointed at Fleming and said, "You will regret the day you tried to steal from me." When police interviewed Corrigan 5 days after the disappearance, he was belligerent and uncooperative. He refused to allow searches of his property without a warrant, and when one was obtained, he created bureaucratic obstacles by claiming certain areas were under federal mining leases and required special permission to access. The subsequent search of Corrigan's accessible land revealed nothing related to the missing team. As winter gave way to spring, hope began to fade. The basketball court at Millfield High remained empty, a silent memorial to the missing team. Classes resumed with a hollowness that permeated every aspect of school life. 17 empty desks stood as stark reminders of the absent students and faculty. In April 1987, a potential breakthrough emerged when a hiker found a blue and gray Letterman jacket belonging to James Pritchard near an abandoned fire tower deep in the National Forest, approximately 7 miles from the Highway 16 route. The jacket was weathered, but intact, with Pritchard's name stitched inside the collar. A massive search of the surrounding area yielded no additional evidence. How the jacket ended up there and whether it was placed there before or after the disappearance could not be determined. By the 1-year anniversary of the disappearance, the active investigation had been scaled back. The case remained open, but leads had dried up. The families of the missing held a memorial service where 17 white doves were released into the sky above the Millfield High basketball court. The gymnasium was later renamed Wolves Memorial Court, with a bronze plaque listing the names of the vanished. Life in Millfield changed irrevocably. Some families moved away, unable to bear the constant reminders of their loss. Others channeled their grief into various causes, from improved safety measures for student athletes to more effective emergency response protocols for rural communities. Diane Wyatt established a scholarship fund in her son's name. Bill Pritchard became an advocate for missing persons cases, often traveling to offer support to other families experiencing similar tragedies. Chief Hayes resigned from the police force 6 months after the disappearance of his son and the team, his spirit broken by the dual burden of personal loss and professional failure. He and his wife divorced a year later, another casualty of the tragedy that had split their lives into before and after. The case of the Millfield Wolves grew into something of a legend, not just locally, but in the annals of unsolved disappearances. True crime enthusiasts debated theories online. Amateur sleuths occasionally made pilgrimages to Millfield, walking the routes the bus might have taken, interviewing aging residents, seeking the breakthrough that professional investigators had never found. Most speculated that the bus had somehow gone off the road into a body of water or a remote ravine, so inaccessible that even the extensive searches had missed it. Others leaned toward more sinister explanations, an orchestrated kidnapping, a cult abduction, or even a mass defection where the team and coaches had voluntarily disappeared to start new lives elsewhere, though no one could articulate a plausible motive for such an action. Decades passed. The parents of the missing players grew old. Some died without ever learning what happened to their children. The town of Millfield itself declined, the lumber mill closing in 1998, population dwindling to under 3,000 by the turn of the millennium. The high school merged with two others to form a regional school located in neighboring Cartersville. The case might have remained forever unsolved, joining the ranks of America's most baffling disappearances, were it not for an unexpected discovery 37 years after that snowy February night. In the spring of 2024, a severe weather system brought unprecedented rainfall to the region, causing flash floods and landslides throughout the Appalachian foothills. On March 18, a section of mountainside collapsed along an isolated stretch of County Road 27, the back road shortcut between Preston and Millfield. The landslide exposed something that had been hidden from view for nearly 4 decades. The rusted frame of a bus, partially crushed and almost unrecognizable, embedded in the side of the mountain beneath layers of soil, rock, and vegetation. County maintenance worker Timothy Dalton was the first to spot the exposed metal while assessing damage from the landslide. "At first, I thought it was just some old mining equipment," Dalton told reporters. "This area is full of abandoned industrial stuff. But then I saw what looked like a window frame, and I knew it was something else entirely." Dalton contacted the county sheriff's office, which quickly established a perimeter around the site. When investigators realized they might be dealing with the long-missing Millfield bus, they contacted the state police cold case unit and the FBI. The recovery operation was complex and painstaking. Forensic archaeologists were brought in to treat the site like an archaeological dig, documenting the position of every piece of evidence before it was removed. The bus had been partially crushed by the initial impact and further compressed by decades of geological pressure. Much of it had deteriorated into rust, with trees and undergrowth having taken root throughout the wreckage. It appears that the bus went off the road at a curve, possibly due to icy conditions, explained State Police Detective Allison Reed, who led the recovery effort. Instead of falling into a ravine where it might have been spotted, it crashed into the mountainside at a point where a previous landslide had created a sort of hollow or cave. The impact triggered another small landslide that effectively buried the bus, hiding it from aerial searches and making it virtually invisible from the road. This explanation answered the decades-old question of how a full-size school bus could vanish without trace. The particular curve where the accident occurred had a deceptive sightline that, combined with the snowfall, might have made the bus's exit point nearly impossible to identify during the original search. The subsequent growth of vegetation over the years would have further concealed any evidence, but the discovery of the bus was just the beginning. What investigators found inside would shed new light on what happened during those final moments, and in the days that followed, challenging every theory that had developed over the 37 years since the Millfield Wolves disappeared. The first shocking revelation came when forensic technicians began to document and recover human remains from the wreckage. Based on preliminary analysis, they could only account for 14 sets of remains, not the 17 people known to have been on the bus. Even allowing for the effects of time, scavengers, and the structural collapse of the vehicle, this discrepancy could not be explained away. 3 people appeared to have survived the initial crash. Among the items recovered from the site was a waterproof athletic bag containing a spiral notebook. The notebook belonged to team manager Frank Olson, a junior who meticulously documented team statistics and served as Coach Fleming's right hand. Most of the notebook contained what one would expect: game scores, player stats, notes on opponents' strategies. But the final pages, written in an increasingly unsteady hand, told a different story. The notebook had been preserved remarkably well inside its waterproof housing, protected from the elements that had deteriorated so much of the other evidence. When investigators carefully separated the moisture-warped pages, they found themselves reading a first-hand account of what happened after the crash, a journal that Frank Olson had kept during what would prove to be his final days. The first entry was dated February 14, 1987, at approximately 1:30 a.m., 4 hours after the crash. Bus crash during snowstorm. Bad injuries. Coach F, Coach T, Mrs. N, and Paul all gone instantly. Thomas badly hurt. Can't move his legs. David and Andrew also critical. Others stable but injured. Michael, James, and I can move around. No way to open doors. Too dark to see outside. Snowing hard, very cold. No response on coach's phone. Subsequent entries documented the survivors' desperate situation. The bus had crumpled upon impact, sealing most exits. The three mobile survivors, Michael Hayes, James Pritchard, and Frank Olson, had attempted to break windows to escape but found themselves facing a wall of soil and rock. They were effectively entombed. Frank's entries grew more dire as February 14 progressed. Thomas died around noon. Internal bleeding, I think. David not responsive. Andrew barely hanging on. The others are deteriorating. No food except some candy bars and chips from after the game. Snow coming in through broken front window. Collecting it for water. So cold. Michael tried to climb out through a small gap, but couldn't make it through. James thinks no one knows where we are. By February 16, the situation had become even more grim. Only 5 of us left now. Andrew went during the night. 4 others since yesterday. James is coughing up blood. Michael and I taking turns staying awake, trying to hear searchers. Nothing. Just wind and occasional sounds from the mountain shifting. We found the emergency kit, but not much useful inside. Used a flare, but no one could possibly see it from outside. James thinks we are buried. The final entry, dated February 18, was brief and haunting. Michael found a way to squeeze through up front. Going for help. James too weak to move. I will stay with him. If anyone finds this, tell our parents we tried to survive. Tell them about Michael. He might have made it. The journal ended there, leaving investigators with a chilling new perspective on the tragedy. It appeared that at least some of the team had survived the initial crash, only to succumb to injuries and exposure in the days that followed. And most significantly, it suggested that one of them, Michael Hayes, son of Police Chief Hayes, might have escaped the wreckage. This revelation transformed the investigation. If Michael Hayes had managed to free himself from the bus, what happened to him afterward? Why didn't he reach help? And what about the other missing set of remains? According to Frank's journal, James Pritchard was still alive when Michael left. Yet only 1 set of remains in the bus remained unaccounted for, not 2. The discovery of James Pritchard's Letterman jacket, miles from the crash site, now took on new significance. Had James somehow also escaped the wreckage later, perhaps following Michael's path? Or had the jacket been removed from the site by someone else entirely? These questions would lead investigators down a disturbing path, one that would unearth secrets kept buried for nearly 4 decades. Secrets that would implicate unexpected figures in the community and reveal that the tragedy of the Millfield Wolves wasn't just a horrible accident, but something far more sinister. As the excavation continued and forensic analysts processed the evidence from the bus, Detective Reed received a call from the county records office. While researching the ownership history of the land where the bus was found, they had discovered something unusual. The parcel of mountainside had been purchased from William Wild Bill Corrigan in December 1987, 10 months after the team's disappearance, by a holding company that eventually traced back to someone very familiar with the case. Former Police Chief Walter Hayes, the father of Michael Hayes, the player who had allegedly escaped the wreckage, had secretly purchased the land where the bus was buried, using a complex web of shell companies to hide his ownership, and he had done so while still actively involved in the investigation of his own son's disappearance. When confronted with this information, the now elderly Walter Hayes, living in a retirement community 2 states away, initially denied any knowledge of the property transaction. But faced with the paper trail and the revelations from Frank Olson's journal, his resistance crumbled. "I need a lawyer," Hayes told Detective Reed. "What happened up there, it wasn't what everyone thinks." As the sun set over the mountains of Millfield on March 25, 2024, Investigators prepared to interview Walter Hayes formally the next morning. They had no idea that his testimony would reveal a conspiracy that had silently festered in the town for 37 years, or that the true fate of Michael Hayes and James Pritchard would prove more shocking than anyone had imagined. The mystery of the Millfield Wolves was finally unraveling. But the truth, as is often the case, would prove far stranger and far darker than fiction. The interview room at the state police headquarters was sparse: a metal table, 4 chairs, and a recording device that seemed unnecessarily large and conspicuous in the digital age. Walter Hayes sat hunched in one of those chairs on the morning of March 26, 2024, his once commanding frame diminished by age and the weight of secrets long carried. At 78, the former police chief of Millfield bore little resemblance to the stern, square-jawed lawman who had led the search for his missing son and the Millfield Wolves basketball team 37 years earlier. Across from him sat Detective Allison Reed and FBI Special Agent Victor Mendez. Between them lay a manila folder containing property records, bank statements, and corporate filings that created a paper trail from Hayes to the mountainside where the bus had remained hidden for nearly 4 decades. "Let's start from the beginning," Reed said, her voice neutral despite the gravity of the moment. "Your son Michael escaped from the bus. According to Frank Olson's journal, he left to get help on February 18. What happened after that?" The recording device captured 18 seconds of silence before Hayes responded. "He found me," the old man said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not right away. He was in bad shape when he got to town." What followed was a testimony that would rewrite the narrative of one of America's most baffling cold cases. Hayes described how his son had indeed managed to escape the buried bus by squeezing through a shattered section of the windshield and a narrow gap in the soil and rock that had entombed the vehicle. Severely injured and suffering from hypothermia, Michael had stumbled through the forest for nearly 2 days, disoriented and delirious. By extraordinary luck, or perhaps guided by an instinctive familiarity with the terrain, Michael eventually emerged onto County Road 27, approximately 5 miles from Millfield. A passing motorist, local mechanic Edward Brennan, found Michael collapsed on the roadside in the early hours of February. But instead of taking the boy to the hospital or calling authorities, Brennan made a fateful decision. Recognizing Michael as the police chief's son, and aware of the massive search underway for the missing team, Brennan drove straight to Walter Hayes' home. "Ed brought him to my back door at around 4 in the morning. Hayes recounted. "Michael was barely conscious, frostbite on his hands and feet, cuts all over him, but he was alive, and he was talking. He told me about the bus, about the crash, about the others still trapped inside. What happened next would haunt the town of Millfield for generations, though the truth remained buried as deeply as the bus itself had been." Walter Hayes, upon reuniting with his son, did not immediately alert the search teams or dispatch rescue personnel to the crash site. Instead, he made a series of decisions that would transform a tragic accident into something far more complex and disturbing. "I should have called it in right away," Hayes admitted, his hands trembling on the table. "That's what eats at me every day. But Michael told me something that changed everything." According to Hayes' testimony, Michael revealed that the crash was not simply an accident caused by treacherous road conditions. Assistant coach Robert Tanner, who was driving the bus, had been drinking heavily during and after the game, not at the gas station in Preston, but from a flask he kept concealed in his jacket. By the time they reached the winding curves of County Road 27, Tanner was significantly impaired. Several of the players had noticed Tanner's condition and alerted Coach Fleming, who had confronted his assistant as they traveled. The confrontation escalated into a physical altercation while Tanner was driving, with Fleming attempting to take control of the steering wheel. In the chaos, the bus veered off the road and into the mountainside. This revelation put Walter Hayes in an impossible position. His son had just told him that the crash, which had likely killed most of the team by that point, was the result of criminal negligence and possibly manslaughter. As police chief, Hayes had a duty to report this immediately and direct resources to rescue any remaining survivors. But Hayes was also a father who had just miraculously recovered his son, who was himself in critical condition. Michael was terrified, Hayes explained. He kept saying they were all dead except for James, and probably Frank. He didn't think James would last much longer. He was convinced that even if we mounted a rescue immediately, we'd only be recovering bodies. In that moment, Walter Hayes made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He told Edward Brennan to tell no one about finding Michael. Then he loaded his semi-conscious son into his personal vehicle and drove him not to the local hospital, but to a private clinic in Tennessee, more than 3 hours away, where Hayes had a connection through his brother, a surgeon. I told them he'd been in a hiking accident, Hayes said. Paid cash, used my brother's address. No one asked too many questions back then, not with enough money on the table. While Michael received treatment, Walter Hayes returned to Millfield and continued to lead the search for the missing team. A search he now knew was futile, at least as a rescue operation. He deliberately directed resources away from the actual crash site, focusing on other routes and theories. When questions arose about the backroad shortcut on County Road 27, Hayes insisted it was too narrow for the bus to have taken, despite knowing it was precisely the route Tanner had chosen. I told myself I was protecting Michael, Hayes said. He was the only survivor. His testimony about Tanner's drinking would have been central to any investigation. There would have been lawsuits, criminal charges, media attention for years. Michael was already traumatized. I convinced myself I was doing the right thing for him. But there was more to the story, much more, as investigators would soon discover. While combing through evidence from the recently excavated bus, forensic technicians made another significant discovery: a handheld video camera, heavily damaged but with its tape still intact. The camera belonged to team manager Frank Olson, who had been recording the game and the team's celebrations afterward. Through painstaking restoration work, technicians were able to recover portions of the footage. Most of the recovered video showed exactly what one would expect basketball plays: teammates celebrating their win, scenes from the bus ride home. But the final segment, recorded approximately 15 minutes before the crash, captured something extraordinary. The footage, shaky and partially obscured as Frank appeared to be filming surreptitiously, showed assistant coach Tanner drinking from a flask in the driver's seat. Coach Fleming could be seen approaching from the back of the bus, his expression darkening as he realized what was happening. The video cut out just as Fleming reached for the flask, presumably the beginning of the confrontation Walter Hayes had described. This footage corroborated part of Hayes's testimony, lending credibility to his account. But it still didn't explain why he had gone to such lengths to conceal the crash site, or why he had secretly purchased the land months later. The answer came from an unexpected source. On March 28, 2024, as news of the bus discovery and Walter Hayes's involvement spread, a lawyer representing the estate of William Bill Corrigan, who had died in 2019, contacted investigators. The lawyer had been instructed to come forward with certain information in the event that the Millfield bus was ever found. That information included a series of audio recordings made by Corrigan documenting conversations with Walter Hayes in the months following the team's disappearance. Corrigan, it seemed, had suspected Hayes was hiding something and had taken the precaution of secretly recording their interactions. The first recording, dated April 12, 1987, captured Hayes approaching Corrigan about purchasing the section of mountainside where the bus had crashed. In the recording, Hayes was explicit about his motivations. "No one can ever find that bus," Hayes could be heard saying. "It needs to stay buried forever." Corrigan, sensing leverage, pressed for details. Hayes's response was chilling in its calculation. "My boy didn't make it out alone," Hayes admitted on the recording. James Pritchard was with him. They both escaped through the same gap, but James was hurt worse. He collapsed about a mile from the bus. Michael had to make a choice: stay with James and probably both die, or leave him and try to get help. He chose to save himself. But that wasn't the full story either. As Hayes continued in the recording, the true horror of what happened on that mountain began to emerge. When Michael found me, I went back with him to find James. We took Ed Brennan with us. James was still alive when we found him, but just barely. He knew Michael had left him. He was angry, delirious, but angry. Kept saying Michael could have helped him walk out, that Michael had taken his jacket for extra warmth and left him to freeze. The discovery of James Pritchard's Letterman jacket, miles from the crash site, suddenly made sense. Michael had indeed taken it, and later discarded it, perhaps out of guilt or fear of it being recognized. James started screaming when he saw Michael. Hayes continued in the recording. Said he was going to tell everyone how Michael abandoned him. Said it was deliberate. That there was bad blood between them over some girl. I tried to calm him down. Told him we were taking him to a hospital, but he wouldn't stop screaming. What happened next transformed the case from a tragic accident and subsequent cover-up into something far darker. Ed had brought a hunting rifle, just for protection, he said. We were in bear country, but when James wouldn't stop screaming, Ed, he just shot him. Point blank. Said it was a mercy killing, that James was going to die anyway. But I saw his face. There was nothing merciful about it. According to Hayes' recorded confession to Corrigan, the three men, Hayes, Brennan, and Michael, had then made a pact. They buried James Pritchard's body deep in the forest, far from the bus and far from the route Michael had taken. They agreed never to speak of what had happened, and most crucially, they ensured the bus would never be found, which would eliminate any evidence contradicting their story that the entire team had vanished without a trace. This was why Walter Hayes had purchased the land from Corrigan, to control access to it permanently, ensuring the bus remained hidden. It was why he had misdirected search efforts away from County Road, and it was why eventually he had resigned from the police force, unable to bear the weight of his deception while facing the grieving families every day. The recordings didn't end there. Corrigan, ever the opportunist, had extorted Hayes for years, demanding increasingly large payments to maintain his silence. The final recording, from 1996, captured Hayes threatening Corrigan after nearly a decade of blackmail. "You have bled me dry," Hayes could be heard saying. "There's nothing left. You go public with this now, and I will make sure everyone knows about those girls from Eastridge. I have got the reports, Bill. Buried them years ago, but I kept copies. You won't be the only one going to prison." This cryptic reference to girls from Eastridge opened yet another avenue of investigation. Eastridge was a neighboring town where 3 teenage girls had gone missing in 1982. Their cases never solved. Had Corrigan been involved? Had Hayes covered it up as police chief? The implications were staggering, suggesting a web of corruption and criminal activity that extended far beyond the Millfield Wolves case. As investigators processed these revelations, they turned their attention to the third missing person in the equation, Michael Hayes. According to his father's testimony, Michael had recovered from his injuries at the Tennessee clinic and had subsequently been sent to live with relatives in California, his identity essentially erased and replaced with a new one to protect him from any connection to the Millfield case. "He became Richard Wilson," Hayes said. "My wife's maiden name. Started over in San Diego. Finished high school there. Went to college. Got married. Had kids of his own. He's built a whole life. One where he doesn't have to carry what happened every day." Investigators immediately began searching for Richard Wilson, but the task proved challenging. There were dozens of Richard Wilsons in the San Diego area alone. Without more specific information, which Hayes claimed not to have, he said they had maintained minimal contact over the years. For security, locating Michael Hayes would require additional leads. Those leads emerged from a surprising source: the contents of Frank Olson's waterproof bag found in the bus wreckage. In addition to the journal, the bag contained several personal items, including a small address book. Among the entries was one for M with what appeared to be a California phone number. The area code matched San Diego. When investigators called the number, they reached a woman who identified herself as Karen Wilson. When asked if she was married to Richard Wilson, she confirmed that she was, but that Richard had passed away from cancer 3 years earlier. He was a wonderful man, she told investigators, a loving father and grandfather. Whatever this is about, I hope it doesn't change that. Karen Wilson agreed to meet with investigators, who flew to San Diego on April 3, 2024. What she shared with them added yet another layer to the increasingly complex case. According to Karen, her husband had indeed been Michael Hayes from Millfield, though he had only revealed this to her after 20 years of marriage. He had described escaping from a bus accident in his youth and being the sole survivor, but the details he provided differed significantly from both Walter Hayes's testimony and the evidence discovered with the bus. In Michael's version, as relayed by Karen, he had been the only one to escape the wreckage. There was no mention of James Pritchard, no mention of returning to the site with his father, and certainly no mention of a mercy killing or deliberate cover-up. In his telling, he had simply stumbled to safety, been whisked away for medical treatment, and then relocated to protect him from the trauma of being the sole survivor, a decision made by loving parents concerned for his mental health. He carried such guilt, Karen explained. Survivor's guilt. He would have nightmares about the crash, about leaving his friends behind. He donated to the memorial scholarship funds anonymously every year. He kept news clippings about the case hidden in his office. It haunted him his whole life. Karen also revealed that shortly before his death, Michael had written a letter, which he instructed her to mail to the Millfield Police Department if the bus was ever found. She provided this letter to investigators. The letter, written in a shaky hand during Michael's final days, offered yet another version of events, one that contradicted both Walter Hayes's testimony and the story Michael had told his wife. In it, Michael claimed that James Pritchard had indeed escaped the bus with him, but had died of his injuries during their journey through the forest. According to this account, Michael had taken James's jacket to use as a pillow for his injured teammate, then continued wearing it after James died because his own had been shredded in the escape from the bus. Michael wrote that when Edward Brennan found him on the roadside, he told Brennan about James's body, and together with his father they had recovered it and given it a proper burial in the forest. Not a callous abandonment or a mercy killing, but a solemn, respectful act necessitated by the circumstances. The letter ended with a plea. If you are reading this, they have found the bus. Please find James too. His parents deserve to know he didn't die in the crash. He was brave. He almost made it. These conflicting accounts, Walter Hayes's testimony, the Corrigan recordings, Michael's story to his wife, and his deathbed letter created a murky picture of what truly happened on the mountain in those February days of night. The only certainty was that the official story that the entire team had vanished without a trace was a fabrication maintained for nearly 4 decades. Based on Michael's letter, investigators began a new search of the forest surrounding the crash site, focusing on the area where James Pritchard's body might have been buried. Using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, they methodically covered the terrain, fighting through dense undergrowth that had reclaimed old logging paths and game trails. On April 17, 2024, approximately 2.3 miles from the bus site, they found human remains in a shallow grave. Preliminary forensic analysis suggested they belonged to a teenage male consistent with James Pritchard's description. More significantly, the remains showed evidence of a gunshot wound to the chest, contradicting Michael's claim of a natural death, but supporting Walter Hayes's recorded confession to Corrigan about Edward Brennan shooting the injured player. Investigators immediately sought to locate Edward Brennan, only to discover that he had died in a hunting accident in 1992, an accident that some now speculated might not have been accidental at all, given his role as a key witness to the events on the mountain. As April turned to May, the investigation continued to expand, with new questions emerging faster than answers could be found. The reference to girls from Eastridge in the Corrigan recordings led to the reopening of those cold cases. Land records showed that Corrigan had owned property near where the girls had last been seen. Former Millfield residents were re-interviewed, many now elderly but with memories still sharp about the tumultuous years following the team's disappearance. One such resident, retired teacher Eleanor Winters, provided investigators with a collection of letters she had received from Mrs. Elaine Novak, the math teacher who had been on the bus as a chaperone. The letters, dated throughout January 1987, expressed Novak's growing concern about assistant coach Tanner's behavior. "He drinks on school property," Novak had written. "I have smelled it on him during afternoon practices. Harold, Coach Fleming, knows but won't confront him, says he needs him for the championship run. I'm going to document everything on the lakeside trip. If I get concrete evidence, I will have no choice but to report him to the board." These letters suggested that the fatal confrontation on the bus might have been brewing for weeks before the fateful trip. They also hinted at why Frank Olson had been filming Tanner surreptitiously. Perhaps Mrs. Novak had enlisted his help in documenting the assistant coach's drinking. The case had evolved from a simple recovery operation into a sprawling investigation spanning 4 decades and touching on multiple crimes. The original crash caused by negligence, the subsequent cover-up, the apparent murder of James Pritchard, the blackmail scheme perpetrated by Corrigan, potential obstruction of justice by Walter Hayes, and the tantalizing connection to the unsolved Eastridge disappearances. On May 10, 2024, as investigators prepared to bring formal charges against Walter Hayes for his role in the cover-up, they received an urgent call from the forensic team, still processing evidence from the bus. Something had been found wedged beneath the driver's seat, something that had survived 37 years of exposure and degradation. It was a small leather-bound journal belonging to assistant coach Robert Tanner. The journal was in poor condition, many pages fused together or rendered illegible by moisture and time, but several entries from February 1987 remained readable. They painted a picture very different from any of the accounts provided thus far. According to Tanner's writings, he had discovered something deeply disturbing about Coach Fleming in the weeks before the Lakeside game, something involving inappropriate relationships with players. The final entry, dated February 13, 1987, the day of the game and crash, was particularly chilling. "Confronted Harold about the photos today before we left. He denied everything, said I was crazy, but I know what I saw. Going to talk to Paul Winston, the athletic director, after the game. Can't let this continue. These are kids, for God's sake. If the school won't act, I will go to the police. The parents need to know what kind of man they have trusted their sons with." This entry suggested a motive for the confrontation on the bus that went far beyond Tanner's drinking. It hinted at a scandal that, had it come to light, would have destroyed Coach Fleming's reputation and possibly led to criminal charges. Had Fleming deliberately caused the crash to silence Tanner? Was the entire tragedy not an accident at all, but a calculated act of violence? As investigators grappled with this new information, they received yet another shock. Forensic analysis of the human remains from the bus revealed trace amounts of an unidentified substance in several of the victims. Preliminary testing suggested it might be some form of sedative, raising the possibility that at least some of the passengers had been drugged before the crash. Walter Hayes, confronted with these latest discoveries, finally broke down completely. The recorded interview on May 15, 2024, captured the full extent of his knowledge and the terrible weight he had carried for 37 years. "It wasn't just about Michael," Hayes admitted, his voice hollow with decades of guilt. "When I went up there with Ed to find James, we found something else too, something in Coach Fleming's bag that had been thrown clear of the bus. A camera. Not Frank's video camera, a different one, with pictures of boys, team members, in hotel rooms, in locker rooms." Hayes described how he had destroyed the camera and its contents immediately, seeing it as one more reason to ensure the bus was never found. In his mind, he was protecting not just his son, but the entire community, and especially the families of the victims from a truth too horrible to confront. I told myself I was doing the right thing, Hayes said, that those families had suffered enough without knowing what kind of man had been entrusted with their sons. But there was one final, devastating revelation still to come. As Hayes continued his confession, he admitted that his knowledge of Coach Fleming's activities predated the crash. In fact, rumors had reached him months earlier, but as police chief and father of a star player, he had deliberately looked the other way. I didn't want to believe it, Hayes said. Michael was having the season of his life. College scouts were coming. There was talk of scholarships. I told myself the rumors were just jealousy, rivals trying to bring down our program. This admission transformed Hayes from a grieving father who made terrible choices in the aftermath of tragedy to something far more culpable, an authority figure who had prioritized basketball glory over the safety and well-being of children, with catastrophic consequences. As May 2024 drew to a close, the once simple story of the Millfield Wolves had become a tangled web of crimes, cover-ups and corruption that spanned generations. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come, one that would call into question everything investigators thought they knew about what happened on that mountain in February. On May 31, as forensic technicians continued their painstaking analysis of material from the bus, they made a discovery that defied explanation. Among the personal effects recovered from Coach Fleming's position in the bus was a sealed plastic bag containing a single item, James Pritchard's student ID card. But according to all accounts, Walter Hayes's testimony, the Corrigan recordings, Michael Hayes's letter, and the physical evidence of the remains found in the forest, James Pritchard had escaped the bus with Michael. If that were true, how could his ID have remained with Coach Fleming's belongings? The answer would emerge from the most unlikely source, a source that would reveal the darkest secret of all, one that had remained hidden even as the other pieces of the puzzle fell into place, a secret that would finally explain why the Millfield Wolves had truly vanished that snowy February night in 1987, and why so many had worked so hard for so long to ensure the truth never came to light. The discovery of James Pritchard's student ID card among Coach Fleming's possessions created a fundamental contradiction in the narrative that had been forming. Every account, from Walter Hayes's testimony to Michael's deathbed letter to Frank Olson's journal entries, had placed James Pritchard outside the bus with Michael Hayes. If James had truly escaped, his student ID should have been with him, not left behind with the coach's belongings. Detective Allison Reed stared at the plastic evidence bag containing the weathered ID card, its blue and gray Millfield Wolves logo still visible despite decades buried in the mountainside. "We are missing something," she told her team during their morning briefing on June, "something that connects all these contradictions." The forensic analysis of James Pritchard's remains found buried in the forest based on information from Michael Hayes's letter had been rushed through the lab. The results confirmed what investigators had already suspected. The body had suffered a fatal gunshot wound to the chest, consistent with Walter Hayes's recorded confession about Edward Brennan's mercy killing. DNA testing had conclusively identified the remains as Pritchard's, and yet here was his ID card, sealed in a plastic bag and stored among Coach Fleming's personal effects on the bus. An object that should have been in James Pritchard's pocket when he allegedly escaped with Michael Hayes. "We need to talk to Walter Hayes again," Reed decided. "He's the only living person who was there that night, the only one who saw James Pritchard after the crash." Hayes, now under house arrest at his daughter's home, pending formal charges related to the cover-up, appeared even more diminished than during his previous interviews. When confronted with the contradiction of the ID card, he stared at the photograph for a long moment before closing his eyes. "I have been carrying this for so long," he said finally. "So many versions of the story. The one I told Michael to tell, the one I told Corrigan, the one I told myself so I could sleep at night. After a while I started believing the lies. What followed was an account so disturbing that the two officers present requested psychological counseling after the interview. The truth, it seemed, was far worse than any of the narratives that had emerged thus far. According to Hayes's final, complete confession, Michael had indeed escaped from the bus alone. There was no second survivor. James Pritchard had died in the initial crash, his body among those trapped in the wreckage. Every account placing James outside the bus had been fabricated, a necessary lie to explain a horrific truth. Michael didn't come straight to me when he got out, Hayes explained, his voice hollow. He was hurt, confused. He wandered in the wrong direction for hours before finding a road. The person who picked him up wasn't Ed Brennan. It was William Corrigan. This revelation cast the entire case in a new light. Corrigan, the eccentric landowner, who had been peripherally connected to the investigation from the beginning, had been the first to encounter Michael Hayes after his escape from the bus. Wild Bill had been out checking his property lines during the storm. He was like that obsessive about trespassers. He found Michael collapsed on a logging road on his land. Instead of taking him for help, he took him to one of his hunting cabins, kept him there for 2 days. Hayes paused, visibly struggling with the weight of his next words. When Michael finally told Corrigan who he was and about the crash, Corrigan realized he had the police chief's son. He saw an opportunity. He brought Michael to me, but not out of kindness. He made it clear that this was a transaction. Corrigan, it emerged, had been under investigation for months prior to the team's disappearance. Walter Hayes, as police chief, had been building a case against him related to the disappearances of the 3 teenage girls from Eastridge. The investigation had been proceeding slowly, hampered by jurisdictional issues and Corrigan's political connections, but Hayes had been convinced of Corrigan's guilt. He told me he'd return Michael on one condition: that I destroy the Eastridge investigation files and never pursue him again. I was in no position to negotiate. My son was injured, traumatized. The crash had just happened. The search was in its early stages. I agreed to his terms. But this was just the beginning of the nightmare. After bringing Michael home and securing medical care for him through his brother in Tennessee, Hayes returned to Millfield to continue leading the search operation. Meanwhile, Corrigan approached him with an even more sinister proposal. He told me he'd been to the crash site, said he found it while tracking Michael's path back through his property. He knew exactly where the bus was, and that everyone inside was dead or soon would be. He offered to help me make the whole thing disappear. Hayes explained that Corrigan owned specialized heavy equipment from his days in the mining industry. He proposed using a bulldozer to trigger a controlled landslide that would bury the bus completely, hiding it from search teams. A partnership of sorts. Hayes would use his position as police chief to protect Corrigan's various illegal enterprises, and in return Corrigan would keep the secret of the bus, and by extension, Michael's survival. I told myself I was protecting Michael, Hayes said, that finding the bus wouldn't bring anyone back, that the families could at least imagine quick deaths instead of knowing their kids suffered for days, slowly dying in the cold and dark. This explained why search efforts had been misdirected away from County Road 27, and why Hayes had later purchased the land from Corrigan through shell companies to maintain control over the crash site and ensure it remained undisturbed. But the most disturbing part of Hayes's confession related to James Pritchard's remains the body found in the forest with a gunshot wound. That wasn't James, Hayes admitted, tears streaming down his weathered face. There was no second survivor from the bus. That body, that was one of the Eastridge girls. Corrigan kept her alive for years. When I started asking too many questions, demanding too much in return for my silence about the bus, he killed her, made it look like she'd been dead for a long time, planted James's jacket nearby. It was a message to me, a reminder that he could expose everything if I didn't cooperate. This explained the presence of James Pritchard's ID card on the bus. He had never left the vehicle alive. It explained why the Letterman jacket had been found miles from the crash site, seemingly discarded along an escape route that never actually existed, and it provided a horrifying connection to the Eastridge disappearances that had been hinted at in Corrigan's recordings. "I helped him bury her," Hayes continued, his voice breaking. "Told myself I had no choice. That he'd reveal everything about Michael, about the bus, about my involvement in the cover-up. I was in so deep by then. There was no way out. The fabricated story about James escaping with Michael, only to die later of his injuries or by Edward Brennan's hand, had been created to explain any potential discovery of the body in the forest. It was an insurance policy against the very situation investigators now found themselves in. The bus discovered, remains found in the surrounding forest, and questions arising about survivors. Michael believed it," Hayes said. "I told him that James had gotten out with him, that they'd been separated in the forest, that James must have died from exposure or his injuries." Michael's memories of those days were confused. The trauma, the hypothermia, the pain medications afterward. He accepted what I told him because it was easier than thinking he'd left everyone behind. The letter Michael wrote before his death, instructing his wife to mail it if the bus was ever found, had been based on this false memory, a fabrication implanted by his father that he carried to his grave. As for Edward Brennan, the local mechanic who allegedly found Michael on the roadside and later participated in the mercy killing of James Pritchard, he had never been involved at all. Hayes had invented his participation to create a witness who could corroborate the story if necessary, knowing that Brennan's death in a 1992 hunting accident meant he would never contradict the narrative. "Ed was a friend," Hayes said. "When he died, I used him as a character in the story. Dead men tell no tales. I never thought anyone would find the bus. I never thought I'd have to actually prove any of this." The revelation that the body in the forest was one of the Eastridge victims rather than James Pritchard prompted an immediate re-examination of those remains. Advanced DNA testing confirmed Hayes's claim the body belonged to Kathleen Morrison, one of the 3 teenage girls who had vanished from Eastridge in 1982. The other 2 victims, Lisa Donnelly and Paula Jenkins, remained unaccounted for. A search of Corrigan's various properties, including several remote cabins and an abandoned mine shaft, was immediately undertaken. Although Corrigan had died in 2019, the properties had remained largely untouched, held in trust by his estate. On June 7, 2024, investigators made a grisly discovery in a hidden cellar beneath one of the hunting cabins: the remains of 2 young women, tentatively identified as Donnelly and Jenkins, bringing a measure of closure to a case that had gone unsolved for over 40 years. The investigation now expanded to include potential accomplices who might have known about Corrigan's crimes or Hayes's cover-up. One name that emerged repeatedly was Vincent Mercer, a former deputy who had worked closely with Hayes during the original search for the Millfield Wolves and who had later become police chief himself when Hayes resigned. When investigators interviewed Mercer, now living in a retirement community in Florida, he initially denied any knowledge of wrongdoing, but confronted with evidence from Hayes's testimony and documentation showing unusual patterns in how the search had been conducted, Mercer eventually acknowledged his role. Walter was falling apart, Mercer admitted. He wasn't sleeping, wasn't eating. He'd disappear for hours and come back looking worse than when he left. I knew something was wrong, but I thought it was just the pressure of the search and worry about Michael. Then one night, about 2 weeks after the teen disappeared, I followed him. Mercer described tracking Hayes to a remote cabin owned by Corrigan, where he witnessed a meeting between the police chief, Corrigan, and a third man he didn't recognize but who was later identified as Gregory Phillips, Corrigan's attorney and financial manager. Confronted by Hayes afterward, Mercer was brought into the conspiracy. He told me Michael was alive, that he'd escaped the crash, but couldn't come forward because he'd be blamed for abandoning his teammates. Said the bus was buried in a landslide and everyone inside was already dead. That finding it now would only bring more pain to the families. Mercer admitted to helping redirect search efforts away from the actual crash site and later, as police chief, ensuring that periodic inquiries into the cold case never ventured too close to the truth. In exchange, he received promotions, political support, and eventually financial compensation through an arrangement with Corrigan. I told myself the same thing Walter did, that it was too late to save anyone, that the truth would only cause more suffering. But deep down, I knew we were protecting ourselves, not those families. The extent of the conspiracy was staggering. It had involved not just Hayes and Corrigan, but also Mercer, Phillips, and potentially others in positions of authority who had helped maintain the cover-up for nearly 4 decades. The case had evolved from a tragic accident into something far more sinister, a deliberate concealment motivated by self-preservation, blackmail, and the protection of a predator who had claimed at least 3 victims before the Millfield bus ever went missing. But there remained unanswered questions about the crash itself. If James Pritchard had never escaped the bus, how could Frank Olson's journal found in the wreckage describe James as being mobile after the crash? And what about the reference to Michael finding a way to squeeze through up front in the final entry? The answer emerged from further analysis of the journal itself. Forensic document examiners noticed subtle differences in the handwriting between the earlier entries and those describing the days after the crash. There were also inconsistencies in the ink composition, suggesting the later entries had been written with a different pen, possibly at a different time. "We believe the journal was tampered with," explained Dr. Elaine Morgan, the forensic document specialist who examined the evidence. The earlier entries appeared genuine game statistics, player notes, typical team manager information, but the entries describing survivors after the crash show signs of forgery. Someone tried to mimic Frank Olson's handwriting but couldn't maintain consistency throughout. This forgery explained the contradictions in the narrative. It appeared that someone, most likely Walter Hayes or William Corrigan, had planted the modified journal in the waterproof bag, anticipating that the bus might eventually be discovered. The forged entries created a false account that supported the story of multiple survivors, specifically naming James Pritchard as one of them. The video footage from Frank's camera, showing the confrontation between Coach Fleming and assistant coach Tanner, appeared genuine, confirming that aspect of the story. Tanner had indeed been drinking while driving, and Fleming had confronted him shortly before the crash. But the journal's claim that some players survived the initial impact for days afterward was likely fabricated to support the narrative Hayes had constructed. As for Tanner's journal found under the driver's seat, with its disturbing allegations about Coach Fleming's inappropriate relationships with players, forensic analysis was inconclusive regarding its authenticity. The journal itself appeared to be from the appropriate time period, and the ink was consistent with 1980s manufacturing. But whether Tanner had actually written those entries or whether they had been planted later to further complicate the narrative remained uncertain. We may never know if those allegations were genuine. Detective Reed acknowledged in her final report, Coach Fleming and assistant coach Tanner are both deceased, as are all the potential victims. The only physical evidence is a journal that may or may not be authentic, found in circumstances that raise questions about its provenance. What had become clear, however, was that the crash itself was almost certainly an accident, the result of Tanner's impaired driving, combined with Fleming's confrontation, all happening on a treacherous mountain road in snowy conditions. What transformed a tragic accident into a 4-decade conspiracy was the subsequent actions of those who sought to exploit the situation for their own benefit. By mid-June 2024, prosecutors had assembled enough evidence to file formal charges against Walter Hayes for obstruction of justice, evidence tampering conspiracy, accessory after the fact to kidnapping and murder in the Eastridge cases, and a host of related crimes. Similar charges were brought against Vincent Mercer and Gregory Phillips, the only living members of the conspiracy besides Hayes. For the families of the Millfield Wolves, the resolution brought a complex mixture of emotions. They had lived for 37 years with the agony of not knowing what happened to their loved ones. Now they had answers. But those answers came with the bitter knowledge that they had been deliberately denied closure by people they had trusted. "We could have buried our children," said Diane Wyatt, mother of Thomas Wyatt, in a statement to the press. "We could have said goodbye. Instead, we have spent nearly 4 decades in limbo, with false hope and endless questions. That time can never be given back to us." The town of Millfield itself was forever changed by the revelations. The declining community, which had never fully recovered from the 1987 tragedy, found itself once again in the national spotlight. This time not as a victim of misfortune, but as the site of a conspiracy that had protected a predator and denied justice to multiple families across 2 separate cases. On July 15, 2024, a memorial service was held at the site where the Millfield High School once stood, now a community park after the school's closure and demolition in 2009. The remains recovered from the bus had been positively identified and returned to the families for proper burial. 17 gravestones in the Millfield Cemetery, which had stood empty for 37 years as cenotaphs, would finally mark the true resting places of the vanished team. Michael Hayes was posthumously cleared of any wrongdoing. Evidence supported the conclusion that he had indeed been the sole survivor, escaping the bus through a broken windshield and making his way through the forest before being found by Bill Corrigan. His subsequent actions, assuming a new identity, relocating to California, and building a new life, were deemed reasonable responses to severe trauma, especially given his age at the time and the influence of his father. Michael Hayes was as much a victim as anyone else in this case. Detective Reed stated during the press conference announcing the findings. A 17-year-old boy who survived a horrific crash, only to be manipulated by adults who should have protected him, including his own father. The life he built as Richard Wilson appears to have been honorable. He raised a family, contributed to his community, and by all accounts carried the weight of his survival every day. Karen Wilson, Michael's widow, attended the memorial service in Millfield, bringing with her photographs of the life Michael had built in California, evidence that despite the trauma and deception that marked his early years, he had found a measure of peace. He never forgot them, she told the assembled families. Every year on the anniversary of the crash, he would light 17 candles. He never told me why until near the end of his life. But now I understand. He was keeping their memory alive in the only way he could. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place on August 3, 2024, when Walter Hayes, facing the prospect of spending his remaining years in prison, took his own life. He left behind a comprehensive written confession, filling in the few remaining gaps in the narrative and expressing remorse that most found too little too late. In his final statement, Hayes addressed the families directly. "I told myself I was sparing you pain by hiding the truth. I was wrong. I robbed you of your right to grieve, to find closure, to honor your children properly. There is no forgiveness possible for what I have done, nor do I seek it. I only hope that knowing the full truth now might grant you some measure of the peace I stole from you 37 years ago." Vincent Mercer and Gregory Phillips both accepted plea deals in exchange for their complete cooperation, receiving sentences that would likely see them spend the remainder of their lives in prison. The extensive documentation they provided implicated several other officials who had participated in or facilitated aspects of the cover-up, though most had died before justice could be served. As for William Wild Bill Corrigan, posthumous investigation revealed him to be one of the most prolific undetected serial killers in American history. Evidence recovered from his properties suggested that beyond the Eastridge victims, he may have been responsible for as many as 12 additional disappearances between 1975 and 2010, spanning multiple states and jurisdictions. His death in 2019 had spared him from facing justice for his crimes, but the exposure of his actions brought closure to families who had waited decades to learn the fate of their loved ones. The case of the Millfield Wolves, once a mysterious disappearance, then a tragic accident, and finally revealed as part of a conspiracy that touched on multiple crimes spanning 4 decades, was officially closed on September 5th. The official report ran to over 700 pages, documenting every aspect of the investigation, from the initial crash to the final revelations. In the gymnasium of the regional high school that had replaced Millfield High, a new memorial was installed, 17 bronze plaques, bearing the names and faces of the team members, coaches, and staff who had boarded the bus on February. Alongside them was a smaller plaque acknowledging Michael Hayes, the sole survivor whose complicated legacy would forever be intertwined with the tragedy. The town of Millfield itself continues to grapple with the aftermath of these revelations. Some residents have pushed to rename the town, seeking to escape the shadow that now hangs over its history. Others insist on preserving the memory of what happened as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of transparency. For Detective Alison Reed, who led the investigation that finally brought truth to light, the case represented both the greatest achievement of her career and its heaviest burden. "Some answers come too late," she observed during the final press conference. "Justice delayed is justice denied, and 37 years is too long for any family to wait. Our system failed these people not just in 1987 but every day since then that the truth remained buried." The bus itself, recovered piece by piece from the mountainside, was preserved as evidence until the conclusion of all legal proceedings. Afterward, at the request of the families, the remains of the vehicle were destroyed, the metal melted down and repurposed into a scholarship fund for young athletes from the region. The scholarship, named simply the 17, makes no mention of Millfield or the specific tragedy from which it emerged. Instead, its purpose is stated in simple terms: to honor promise cut short, and to ensure that the future remains bright for those who follow. In the end, the case of the Millfield Wolves transcended the boundaries of a simple missing persons investigation or even a complex criminal conspiracy. It became a meditation on memory, on grief, on the human capacity for both terrible cruelty and remarkable resilience. The 17 who boarded the bus that snowy February night in 1987 never returned home, but in finally discovering the truth of their fate, they were at last allowed to rest, their memory preserved, not as an unsolved mystery that haunted a dying town, but as a testament to the enduring power of truth to emerge, even after decades of darkness. And for the families who had waited 37 years for answers, there was at last the cold comfort of certainty, the knowledge that while nothing could bring back their loved ones or restore the decades lost to grief and uncertainty, the truth, however painful, had finally set them free from the purgatory of not knowing. The mystery of the Millfield Wolves was solved. The true horror lay not in their disappearance, but in how close the truth had come to disappearing with them.